Hi, everybody. Being almost, I guess it's 9 months now inside, I had hoped that I wasn't going to be doing Zoom calls and I'd be able to start traveling again. But since that's not going to happen, I'm very honored that I was invited to do this particular presentation. So this is Syrian Jews from Aleppo to Brooklyn, and I was asked to cover a little bit of Aleppo and the century that we've been in Brooklyn, and I really should say the Brooklyn area because it extends out to Deal, New Jersey. So let me start by just showing you a picture of my grandparents. This is Frieda and Joseph Missry. They are my father's parents, and they were married in 1909. And my grandmother herself came in 1907, and my grandfather, Joseph, came in 1908 to escape military conscription from the Turkish army. In 1907, the Ottoman Empire fell, and what we'll learn about later is that dhimmi status was ended, and they started to conscript men into the army. And they're really the reason that I started in genealogy and I started in, searching my family history so that I could understand more of, their background and my background as a child. This is a little map that shows you Aleppo is way up here. You can see my little pointer here. It's kind of in the mountains. It's very close to the Turkish border. And Aleppo itself was the center of, it was the center because a lot of people would send to Aleppo for opinions, rabbinical opinions, for the surrounding communities which bordered, and many went into what's today Turkey. Obviously, these borders weren't here during the Ottoman Empire. You can see Damascus is pretty far away. It's about 170 miles, and it's much closer to Israel, to Jerusalem. So they would send to Jerusalem for their opinions. And really, these two communities didn't know each other because 100 years ago, going from Aleppo to Damascus or back would have been quite a trip because the roads weren't very good. We're going to basically talk about how they lived, their religion, the Aleppo Codex, their education, their occupations, immigration, and today. So just a little timeline. Jews are found living in Aleppo and Damascus, which was considered part of Greater Palestine as early as 1000 BCE. The Great Synagogue of Aleppo was supposedly built in 950 BCE. It's a stone structure. It survived quite a bit. Of course, I don't know how it is today because since the war, we have no idea what's going on inside that country. Around 200 CE, there were, in the Common Era, east-west trade routes linked Damascus to Central Asia, where silk and spices are sold. And these caravan routes became an important point of commerce for the Syrian Jews. It was dubbed the Silk Road in the 1870s. In 636, there's the Arab conquest of the region, and Islamic caliphates begin to rule the region. In 896, the Aleppo Codex is written, and we're going to talk more about that later because it's an extremely important document. In 921, Sajid Gaon visits Aleppo, and he writes about his visit. And in the 10th century, we have Jews that moved from Iraq to Syria. Now, how did they live? So my biggest source for this is a book written by Shamish, and he writes about what the Hush was. In the old cities, if you were a Jewish person living in any Ottoman city, you did not have the right to have a window that faced the street. So you had a subservient status, and that subservient status was called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So often what would happen is you would have a door that went in from the street, or the little passageway because they didn't really have streets 200 years ago the way that we know them today. And it would enter into a courtyard. And within that courtyard, there might be 3 or 4 houses. And those windows faced onto the street. And the courtyard would have a central fountain. There might be an oven, and people would sit out, but they would go, their windows would face onto the courtyard. They wouldn't face onto the street itself. So they describe themselves and they think of themselves as Arab Jews. A lot of them are very religious. And this dhimmi status, it's actually in the Quran that they were not equal to Muslims. So they could self-govern. They were autonomous communities. But if there was a civil action between a Jew and a Muslim, it had to go to the Muslim courts, and the word of a Muslim would always be taken over the word of a Jew. And this went also for Christians, I should say. It wasn't just Jews. This is a photo of the inside of the Damascus Synagogue. It's really quite magnificent. And these are photos of the Aleppo Synagogue, and you can see there's an outdoor central courtyard. And this is where they would bring the Torah to pray on Saturdays. The community, in about the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman government created the position, and it was a government position called the Hacham Bakshi. The Hacham Bakshi was the chief rabbi. He was a government official. He wore a fine robe. He had government appointed bodyguards, and he carried a staff of his office. Now, this particular position, although it was appointed by the Ottoman government, it was a negotiated position between community leaders. There was a recommendation that had to go for this appointment, things like that. So there are a lot of politics that went into this particular appointment. There's a very good book on this by Yaron Harel called Intrigue and Revolution. I highly recommend it because it really talks about the politics that went into the Hacham Bakshi position. So the Aleppo Codex is a very important document, and the truth is I can do a complete presentation just on this. It's a document that was written in Safed, and it's considered to be, it was considered by the community to be a talisman. It was delivered to the community. It was there in the cave of Elijah for about 800 years. And it had the cantillation and the intonation of the entire Torah. And Maimonides consulted this document, and it was really considered to protect the community. And so very few people actually saw it. There were many, many times that scholars would go to Aleppo to view the document, but it was never allowed out. There are some people, I want to say about 8 instances that are documented of people that actually got to see it. If you want to see this, it is currently on display in Jerusalem in the same building as the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was smuggled out in 1957 after the riots, literally in a rug. It was rolled into a rug and smuggled into Turkey, and then it got its way to the Ben-Zvi Institute in Jerusalem.
Yeah, may I ask a question about that? I was in Jerusalem last year and I saw the Aleppo Codex, but afterwards I read that it wasn't the original that I saw, but some sort of copy. Is that correct?
I can't tell you what the Ben-Zvi Institute did. I can tell you that it is in Jerusalem. There's a very good book on the Aleppo Codex by Mati Friedman. He's a journalist. There are pages that are missing from it, all from one section. I think it's 296 leaves. And he talks about, his book goes into the investigation of what happened to those leaves. About, I want to say about 15 years ago, someone in my community died, and they found one of the pages in his wallet. He viewed it as, like I said, a talisman. And so there's a concern that some people have hidden these pages or taken them, and they're in their homes. So I can't answer that. And that's really a whole different presentation.
Okay, sorry for the interruption.
It's okay, it's okay.
Okay.
Education in Syria until very late was limited only to boys and until their bar mitzvah. It was a kitab education, primarily in Hebrew and Arabic and religious subjects, although math was taught because it was needed for trade. Girls had a very limited education. For the most part, they did not go to school. My grandmothers, both of them, came to America without ever having gone to school. They did, the Alliance created schools in the 1880s, some in the 1870s, and there many people learned French. The area was a French protectorate later on in the after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So the people who had the means to send their girls to school would send them to the Alliance. I will say that my husband's grandfather went to a Catholic school because they provided, his family felt, a better education. So you will have some families that might have been a little bit better off that would have sent their children to a different type of religious school. Occupations in Syria were primarily in silk and textiles due to the caravan routes from east to west. When the Suez Canal opened, this really affected the caravan routes, and it really was a death knell to them. And economy in that region became very, very difficult. For many centuries, they also controlled the customs houses, and they were interpreters because they had many languages. In the 17th century, you had people, Jews, Francos, coming into Aleppo. So 1492, you had the expulsion from Spain, and some of those people made their way into the Ottoman Empire, but some had settled in Italy. And those who had settled in Italy, they called them the Francos, would later move on to Aleppo because of the issue of trade. Many of them had international trade and were able to set up different places around the region that from which they could operate. So the role of women was basically as the keeper of the home. They never left their home unescorted. We were Muslim society. They didn't shop. The men shopped and made sure that the women had what they needed in the home. And women were measured by their ability to cook and entertain. Most girls were married by the age of 13 or 14 in arranged marriages. Food of the Middle East was, basically, I think when you think of Sephardic cooking, it's a lot of times it's what's available in your local area. So in this area, it would have been apricots, it would have been pistachios, it would have been dates. The food is rich in spices and vegetables. If you're not familiar with kibbeh, lahamajin, hamda, and sambusak, I suggest that you find a nice Middle East place to eat because these are very basic foods for us. And they would shop in souks, and they would even set up souks when they left Aleppo, and these were places that had the food that they liked to eat or had the ingredients that they needed to prepare their food. So immigration, because the economy was bad, immigration begins, I want to say in the late 1880s, 1890s to Jerusalem. A lot of rabbis leave. But they also go to Egypt, they go to Manchester. But in 1907, when the Ottoman Empire falls, a lot of men start leaving. People are putting their kids on boats to America, any place they could send them so that they could escape military conscription. My own mother's father, my grandfather, was literally just taken off the street, thrown into a truck to be taken into military conscription. But what happens is he's able to escape, and he made his way to America. Now, when they get to America, what happens? So you have an organization called the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. And what this organization did was they were supposed to meet Jews as they came off the boat and help place them in homes. You also had people who would come before, Syrian Jews, would go and meet the boats and try and say, okay, this is where our community lives. But the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society would place men with Ashkenazic families, and their food was different, their language was different. So while these men had used an Arabic accented Hebrew, the Ashkenazic families had different pronunciations. And they would go to synagogue and they would say, if you don't speak Yiddish, how could you say you're Jewish? Because they didn't know anybody who was Jewish who didn't speak Yiddish. And these people spoke Arabic. So language was a problem. And it took them a while to just settle themselves and go into separate praying areas. After World War I, there's a large immigration. And people going into the United States, they go to Panama, they go pretty much all over South America. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina have large Syrian Jewish communities, but the largest ends up in Brooklyn. Now, there's three basic reasons for immigration. One was the economy, which I discussed. The second was the takeover by the Young Turks and the end of dhimmi status and the conscription into military service. I should also mention that in 1901, Herzl had called for the formation of a Jewish state and the buying of land in Eretz Israel. And this concept meant equality for Jews. Equality for Jews under a Muslim society does not exist, okay? It's not in the Quran, and there is no such thing as equality. So this caused difficult conditions for Jews living in these Muslim countries, places they had lived and learned to live under the radar for many centuries. I'm not saying that things were beautiful. What I'm saying is many people thought they didn't have problems in many of these countries, but I really believe it's because they learned to live under the radar. They learned to live within the boundaries of that society and not draw attention to themselves. Okay, so they go to New York, they're on the Lower East Side, they're finding places to pray. After a few years, enough of them decide that they want to get out of the Lower East Side, and the Sea Beach line to Brooklyn opens. Now, the Sea Beach line opens Brooklyn up to an area called Bensonhurst. And what happens is that these early immigrants open a synagogue called Magen Synagogue. And this is a photo from the parade, which opens up that synagogue where they're celebrating their first synagogue in 1920. Now, the Lower East Side had something that I wanted to talk about. It had, this woman was my great aunt, and she opened a restaurant called the Egyptian Rose. Men had worked as peddlers before they moved into retail. And what would happen was because the area was primarily Yiddish, her restaurant was a place they went, kind of like an early Jewish community center, where they would go, she would cook whatever she cooked that day, that's what you ate. And you would say, oh, go to the pots, and you'd say, I want this, this, or this. There was no menu, she didn't know how to read or write, she just knew how to cook. And she would spin her tales, and men would come and they would play toleh, which is the Arabic word for backgammon, or they play cards, or and she would spin her tales and tell stories. And this was their hangout before they brought over their families. You should know that, remember I pointed out on the map that Aleppo and Damascus are something like 150, 175 miles apart. But the first time they're together is here on the Lower East Side. So to them, they're two different communities, even though they're both from Syria. And so you didn't intermarry, an Aleppan Jew didn't marry a Damascus Jew. They were two different, it was like intermarriage for them back then. They do form a burial society early on called Rodfa Zedek, which is still in existence today. They prayed in small groups. There are several rabbis, but they all work in trade during the week. And Rabbi Chaim Towel is the leading rabbi. Children all attend public school and then continuation school. High school did not exist back then. And the community establishes a small Hebrew school where volunteers teach after school. So you'd go to public school till 3 o'clock, and then from 3 to 5, you'd go to an after school program called a Talmud Torah for 2 hours. So they go across the river, they go to Bensonhurst. Children still attend public schools, and they have 2 synagogues. One's for Aleppo Jews and one's for Damascus Jews. This is the Ahiezer, the first one, and this is for the Damascus Jews. And this is the Magen David congregation, which is for Halabi Jews. I'm going to show you a little video. I'm going to turn off the sound and just talk through it myself, because I understand the sound isn't very good. This video was made by Brooklyn Jewish Historical Initiative and Sephardic Heritage Project. So this is the outside of the building. It's Romanesque style. And it was built in 1920. And this is the parade in the street when the synagogue is opened. People are very, very, very excited about this building. You can see from the inside that the pews are the original pews. You can see the teba in the middle there. And it's really, really, really quite beautiful. They bring Rabbi Jacob Kassin in 1933. These are the Torahs. And when they bring Rabbi Kassin, he becomes the first chief rabbi of the community. He comes in 1933 with his wife and children. He is a Talmud Chacham his family's from Aleppo, but he himself was born in Jerusalem as his family had left Aleppo. Look how young his wife looks. She's like a child. Isaac Shalom was a philanthropist of the community, and he's one of the leading people in the formation of the synagogue. Moshe Asher was a Hazan and a poet. And you could see that they've made a museum in the lobby of the congregation with all of their artifacts. The museum curator is Estra Ashkenazi, and here is a picture of him showing me the assigned seats of my own family from back in the 1940s and 50s when they would have attended this synagogue. And he's explaining to me about my grandparents, about my father, about my uncle and my aunt, and where they were sitting in the synagogue. So it's really quite a beautiful structure. I wanted to show you that because I thought it's interesting. And here's all of the founders of the synagogue museum pieces. I'm going to stop the video and keep going. Okay, how do we get out of this? Okay, so Bensonhurst is an area of Brooklyn. It's if you've been watching the news and you've been watching the hotspots for COVID-19, this is one of the hotspots. The community no longer lives in this area. They moved a little bit to the adjacent community along Ocean Parkway, which is right over here. But this is the area of detail. In their occupations, they had moved from being peddlers to retail, where they sold a lot of textiles and tablecloths. Men usually on Saturday went to synagogue in the morning and then went to work. That's how they survived economically. I would tell you that in the early part of the 20th centuries, the 40s and 50s, you saw a lot of retail and people just had to work. The economy was bad. They kind of didn't have a choice. There was some import-export, especially in children's clothing. There's a tendency to hire relatives. but you wanted to make sure that your family was taken care of, and economy was a huge thing. They eventually move out of this. There's also a lot of electronics. People move into electronics, and a souk forms along 20th Avenue in Bensonhurst, and this is again to provide ingredients needed to prepare foods from Syria. At this point, now we're in the 40s and 50s and 60s, all children are attending public schools. The boys go to the Talmud Torah in the building adjacent to the congregation, and public schools are really seen as excellent. There's a lot of resistance to opening a yeshiva, which is something Isaac Shalom wants to do. People thought that a yeshiva would attract anti-Semitism, and they wanted to blend in as Americans. This is a very Sephardic concept, blending in as American, not separating yourself out. Of course, they blend in terms of language, in terms of dress, but they're very culturally they remain together as a group. There's also this idea about summer resorts. Now, when I grew up, my family had a store in a summer resort in Rhode Island, but this was a huge phenomenon because summer resorts were extremely profitable. So families would go to a resort for the entire summer. They would start Memorial Day and they would end a little after Labor Day. And these are beach communities. They were family ventures. People worked 7 days a week from 9 in the morning until 10, 11, 12 at night. And some people had resorts that they went to in the north in the winter, but then in the south, in the north in the summer, and then in the south, like Florida, in the wintertime. And these are just some locations that my own family had, but I can tell you this was pretty broad. Many, many people had these kinds of stores. So Rabbi Kassin comes in 1933. Now he has a brother who goes to Mexico, and he has another brother, Shlomo, who stays in Israel. He's a Talmudist. He's a Kabbalist. He's very, very, very well respected. He organizes a rabbinical council. He sees the community works on the Sabbath, and they've moved away from Torah values. He sees the influence of Americanism. Now, in 1934, it was estimated that 15 people in the community married non-Jews or converts. This was a big deal. So in 1935, he issued a Takana, which is a rabbinical edict against marriage to converts. It's a complete rejection of conversion to Judaism. I'm going to tell you that this particular item is a complete presentation on its own. The Takana says in English, no male or female member of our community has the right to intermarry with non-Jews. This law covers conversions. He points to a 1927 edict in Argentina as the basis to build and establish an iron wall to protect our identity and religious integrity, and to bolster the strong foundations of our faith and religious purity, which we have maintained for many centuries, going back to our country of origin, Syria. This is the original document, as written in the hand of Rabbi Kassin, and as signed by 3 rabbis in the community. Rabbi Chaim Towel, Rabbi Jacob Kassin, both sign and stamp this, along with another rabbi whose name I can't read right now. And this is like a big deal. Now, this Takana, not only does it say we're not going to accept convert, it forbids the community rabbis from performing conversions. And it warns that if community members ignore the edict, others will be advised not to marry their children. So there's social ramifications to it. And it really becomes the cornerstone of the community. And they claim that it reduced the rate of intermarriage to less than 2% annually. I will tell you that there is no member of our community who is not affected by this Takana. That somebody somewhere has somebody in their family who did marry out and moved away. including Rabbi Jacob Kassin. His own granddaughter married out. Social occasions, this picture here is my mother's mother. She started Salem Catering, which was she converted the garage of her house, which was located in the backyard, to a kitchen because there were no catering halls back then. So she would cater people's engagement parties, brit milahs, bar mitzvahs, sabbats, social occasions. People would go to the synagogue to get married, and they would come back to the house and have their party. And so she caters these events, and she supported 8 children with this business before any social hall ever opened in the community. And that's the genesis, by the way, for my cookbook's backyard kitchen. Our men served in the military. I think nearly 1,000 people served in the Army and the Navy during World War II. And this publication called the Victory Bulletin is newsletters that are put out every month during World War II to tell of news coming from the war. And all of these can be downloaded from our Sephardic Heritage Project website. They're there as PDFs. So in Syria, the community was socially and religiously segregated from their Muslim and Christian neighbors. But in Brooklyn, those barriers are gone, and the effects of assimilation and acculturation start to touch the community. Men come home from World War II, and they're seeing what it is outside the community. They're seeing, what is life outside a Jewish community. And for the first time, they're bringing home non-Jewish wives. So in 1945, the Takana is reaffirmed. It's reaffirmed again in 1972, and consequences are added. Now, the consequences are things like you can't have an aliyah, you can't be buried in the community cemetery, you can't get married, you can't have any simchas. If you have a son, you can't have his bar mitzvah in the synagogue. And what they eventually do is they have every rabbi and the president of each institution in the community sign it. They hang it in the lobby of every institution. It's a big plaque, and the Takana is read in Hebrew and in English on the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur every year, aloud, to remind people, because that's when the synagogues are full. This is a community that not only lives together, but they take vacation together. They spent their summers in Bradley Beach and later moved on to Deal, New Jersey. And then they start moving to the Ocean Parkway area, which is dubbed Aleppo and Flatbush by the author Joseph A.D. Sutton. This is an example of a home in this area. This is Shaare Zion congregation, which is the Aleppan congregation. This opens in 1960, and it's considered the mother synagogue for the community. It was expanded in 2000. It's a magnificent dome sanctuary. This is Achiezer, which opened just down the street from Shaare Zion. And this is again the Damascus Synagogue. It had moved from the Bensonhurst area here. The Yeshiva Education becomes very heavily supported. It starts to open in 1946 with just a few students, and gradually it builds itself up. And by the mid-60s, pretty much all new students to education are going into a yeshiva. The community does put up a bit of resistance as they can't afford tuition, but Isaac Shalom wins out. So I just wanted to also mention that by the early 60s, when virtually all school-age children are attending yeshiva, this coincides with the civil rights movement and the desegregation of public schools. Now, if you open a school and you don't believe in college education, who is going to teach in your yeshivas. So this community felt their children, their sons should go into business. The girls were going to be homemakers. So there was no professional class. You had no one to teach in the yeshivas. And the state mandated licensed, trained teachers. So the yeshivas, the Sephardic yeshivas, had to rely on the Orthodox frum to teach in their schools. And schools, yeshivas have a dual curriculum, a secular curriculum, which was required by the state, as well as your Jewish curriculum and your Hebrew. So the result is this decline in Judeo-Arabic culture because you have Orthodox teachers who are teaching the students. And they're also giving different values to the students. And boys were trained to go into their father's businesses, and girls, even myself, when I was a kid, I was not expected to go to college after high school. In fact, I didn't graduate college till 20 years after I graduated high school because it just wasn't expected. Now, men also served in Korea, but by Vietnam, there was an avoidance of military service. Some people enlisted in the National Guard so they could avoid active duty. So by the 70s, these Orthodox frum are influencing the students to go to college. And so now you start to see the emergence of a professional class. And there's a need for it because these men are in business that have international liaisons. So you're talking about a need to understand international trade. And they're no longer hiring community members just because they are Syrian Jews. Now you had to be qualified. And more men are going to college. And as a result, you have a broad range of professional classes in the community. And women also are starting to attend college. Pretty much today, everybody goes to college. But the administration remains Ashkenazic. And there's a stratification of beliefs because of this Orthodox frum influence. And so the new yeshivas start to open, and what happens is you have the modern Orthodox, which is kind of the originals, and then you have this Haredi and black hat influence, which is really not a part of Sephardic culture. It's an emergence that comes out much later and causes a division in the community. We have many institutions. We are a city among ourselves. We have a burial society. We have the cemetery. In fact, we've outgrown cemeteries and just bought a third one. We bought the complete plot of land where they're planning to build everything you need to have your services. We have gamaz, we have mikvot, we have business guidance and career services. We have a food fund. We have search, which is to locate medical specialists. We have SAFE, which is for a drug education program. We have social service institutions that are privately funded. We have senior citizen housing, 4 buildings. We have our own Bikor Holim, which provides tremendous mental health services, as well as other things for the poor. We have a community center that was just doubled in size. It is so big and so robust that it was necessary. It was originally formed as for youth, to provide a safe place for youth to go, but it has senior citizen programming, it has sports leagues, it has gyms, it has a pool, it has exercise facilities, you name it, you can find it. Oh, they have a camp, summer camp. Now, we know that after World War II, that there were many Jews left in Syria, people who had not made it out before the creation of the state. But in 1972, the Muslim Islamic Congress meets and declares that all Jews had to be declared as aggressive combatants. Jews are banned from leaving the country. And this woman, Judy Feld-Carr, is a high school teacher in Canada, and she begins to raise money to bribe officials to let people out. The Committee for the Rescue of Syrian Jews is started, and they start to smuggle people out of Syria. It is the most amazing operation. I'm currently finishing a book called La Dor Vador about my own family heritage. And I found out that actually my family had people left in Syria, and they told me how they escaped. They told me about the fake passports. They told me about getting to the border at midnight when the guards changed, about being smuggled in the trunk of a car all the way to Damascus, about hiding out in the basement of the synagogue for a month until they were given the clear to go to the shore. About, this is in Beirut, sorry, they make it to Beirut. They get to Beirut, and after a month, they're given the clear. Late at night, they're taken in small rowboats 3 miles out offshore into international waters, where suddenly a submarine would surface, and that submarine would pick them up and take them to Haifa. And that's how they were able to escape. It cost about $1,600 a person to do this. And it was easier to do this than to bribe officials. This was, there's amazing oppression. There is, you all know the story of Eli Cohen, who was the spy. That's the type of torture that you would have seen. People who tried to escape could have been killed at the border. So after years of oppression in the early 1990s, in 1992, political pressure is brought, and Assad opens the door for immigration. And within a 3-week period, there is support by the Syrian community and Jewish JDC, you name the organization. They airlift about 5,000 Jews out of Syria. Now this brings a resurgence of Judeo-Arabic culture that had been lost by the 4th generation. New immigrants were absorbed into the community and settled. They were given visas, tourist visas, but we found that they were very educated people. There were many doctors in the group, doctors who are active today in the community. And I want to say that the community is not Syrian really anymore. It's Lebanese, it's Egyptian, it's Moroccan, it's Iranians and Persians and Israelis. All of these ethnic groups come into the community, but in order to live in the community, they have to agree to be under that 1935 Takana. They have to agree when they open that they're not going to allow intermarriage. They're not going to allow marriage to converts. They're going to reject all intermarriage. And when I say intermarriage, it's to someone who converts to Judaism. The separation of the Damascus Jews and the Aleppan Jews by the 1980s, it's pretty much gone. The community is more religious because of yeshiva attendance, and the men begin to go primarily into wholesale, and they start to study. There are many kollels where they study at night. In Aleppo and in Syria and in much of the Ottoman Empire, there was that keeping a low profile. Today, there's a recognition that higher voter turnout enables you to leverage political attention for your causes, such as the Syrian Jews remaining in Syria. So today, pretty much everybody votes. We now have several high schools, yeshiva high schools. Until the 80s, there was no community high school. This is the high school of Magen David. It's called Silya Esses High School. This is the Magen David Yeshiva. This is the second one. The first one closed, and this one was built about 15 years ago. Today, there are over 20 synagogues. In Shaare Zion alone, there are 6 congregations within the larger building, each following a different rabbi. And every congregation has a youth minyan, a father-son minyan, and this is to support what's happening in the yeshivas. The boys run their own services. there are pretty much every professional career you can see today. There is a decline in the summer resorts, although there are some people who are still in this, but mostly people are in wholesale. This is an example of some homes in our community. I should really take new pictures. Over the last century, I would tell you our community we have a reputation to being affluent and business savvy. There are about, I want to say about 70,000 people in the community. We've acculturated in terms of language, dress, and education, but we still have the social mores of Aleppo in an insular community. We're much more observant, ranging from modern Orthodox to Haredi. There's great respect for our rabbis, and the rabbis credit that 1935 Takana with our low intermarriage rate. And that's it. I'm ready for your questions. These are my books. The proceeds from these books benefit Sephardic Heritage Project, and they're all on Amazon.
Thank you very much. May I initially ask a question about genealogy, because obviously Aleppo has suffered very greatly and the Jewish community has left. What genealogical records might survive from Aleppo? And also, could you talk about the relationship between the Francos and what you've called the Arab Jews? Did they go to the same synagogues? Were they separated, or how do they relate to each other?
So basically what you have, let's start with your first question about genealogical records. I'm going to tell you that if you go to the Sephardic Heritage Project website, I have lists and lists and lists of sources for Sephardic genealogy. For Aleppo alone, I will tell you that the Sephardic Heritage Project was able to obtain the original Brit Milah records and marriage records from Aleppo, and these were from the Dayan family, which was a family of Mohelim. And so we got their log books, and over the course of about 7 years, we translated and databased those records. Those records are available on sephardicgen.com as they are on jewishgen.org. We also translated about 1,400 marriage records. Those are also online on those same two websites. We've been able to pull in, based on my relationships and my reputation, records from cemeteries in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Cuba, Venezuela, and we've been working with different communities to try and pull in records. We have a number of projects that are right now in progress. For example, we were able to obtain the ketubot. We have thousands of them, the physical documents from the Moroccan community in Buenos Aires. So what we need is a Spanish-speaking volunteer that will help us with translating those documents. What we've done is we've created a spreadsheet, and you basically have to read it and pull out pieces of information. And that's what a lot of these genealogical records are, is that you're pulling the information from the actual record. I was in Bogota, Colombia last year, and we were able to get immigration documents. I had thousands of them. They're all images. Somebody needs to, and again, those are in Spanish. We have other records in French. I have from Cairo, no, maybe it's Alexandria. I have in Hebrew records of Brit Milah that were done from Alexandria. There's 350 pages. I need 2 or 3 volunteers, one to do a first run, one to proof it, and the second person to proof it. And they all have to know English and be able to read that Hebrew. It's a modern Hebrew. So, and there's 350 pages. So that's, it's a lot of work. All of these projects are a lot of work. And we rely on volunteers to help us with that work.
And sorry, the second part of my question was about, were the Francos and the Arab Jews, did they belong to a single entity? Obviously at the moment, a lot of people are trying to claim Portuguese citizenship. And in some countries, it's quite difficult to work out who was who.
So I will tell you that I have a genealogy research company, a for-profit company, in which I process many of these citizenships. So let me start with your first question, which is about the Francos. And the Francos did not have separate places to pray. They prayed within the existing structure of the community. However, they did have different beliefs or different ways that they felt, different traditions that they wanted to hold. And because they were not dhimmi and they held European citizenship, they did not feel that they had to adhere to the community leaders and what the community leaders said. So this became a source of problem. Now, they contributed to the economy, they provided jobs, they donated a lot to the community institutions. So they were of prime value in that they helped lift the community up. But there was dissension between the European Jews, the Francos, and the existing indigenous Jews. And this led to a rabbinical opinion by Rabbi Chaim Mordecai Labaton in the late 18th century. It's in my book, Branching Out from Sepharad. I go into it in quite some detail. Back to your question about whether or not they can get Portuguese citizenship. They can, all of them can. My family is Sephardic. I got Portuguese citizenship.
Okay, because in London, we would need proof that somebody had a connection with the Iberian Peninsula.
So in America, if you have a letter from a rabbi that says you're a Sephardic Jew, that letter is accepted by Oporto.
Okay, that's a different question. Ton, do you want to go through some of the questions asked? Oh, we seem to have lost Tom for the moment. Whilst I go into the questions, before the meeting, we had a message from somebody who can't attend, who was specifically asking about Syrian Jews in Costa Rica. You already mentioned that people went to a variety of Latin American countries. Was there a community, or is there a community in Costa Rica?
I believe there is. There's in Costa Rica, there's Colombia, several communities, and pretty much all over Latin America, you'll find Syrian communities. And they all have takanas, I should mention. Yeah. Every Syrian community in Latin America has a takana.
Okay, question from Bernard about the 20th century for a book that he's writing. He used a children's young adult novel called Through the Flames of Aleppo, based on the true story of Jews who had to flee from Arab attacks in Hebron in the 1930s and ended up in Aleppo. Do you know anything about that event?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You can look it up.
There's a various discussion about who is a Sephardic the definition Jew of Sephardic or not, which is we won't go on here. Alain Fahy says that many of these genealogies are on his site, fahy.org.
Yes, that's a phenomenal site to look at, and there are many great genealogies there. I will tell you also, though, that he says, how is it, I see a question here from Anne Sirota, who's saying if they existed since ancient times, how is it that they are Sephardic? And I'll tell you that Sephardic doesn't necessarily mean from Iberia. And I think that David has a problem with that definition, but In my book, I go into several Torah sources that talk about Sepharad being an area north of Jerusalem, which happens to be Syria. And Syria actually has a special place in terms of many of the halakhic implications to Jerusalem. And there is if you just Google the term Sephardic Jew, you'll come up with an article that I wrote which defines today's definition of a Sephardic Jew. And it includes many areas that may not, and I know that I could see from David's face that he disagrees with me. There are communities that don't believe that they're either Sephardic or Ashkenaz. You know, if you look at Greek Jews, many of them, they do not believe. Baghdadi Jews, they don't believe they're either Sephardic or Ashkenaz. Italiani Jews don't believe they're Sephardic or Ashkenaz, but they are accepted under that because that's their tradition. That's the way they pray. They don't necessarily have to be from Iberia. So,
I mean, I will send the defense. The senior rabbi of my community, Joseph Dweck, is a Syrian Jew from the United States, and another Aleppan Jew, and another Daniel Carter, who's the secretary of our Bet Din, is also Syrian Jew. I think his family is from Damascus. So it's as far as I'm concerned, you know, we're all Jews. It's not a particularly serious issue for me. Ton, are you here? You seem to have gone very quiet. Oh dear, Ton has gone very quiet on us indeed. Does anybody have any questions or any statements? I was thinking, let me just see if I can.
I see a question here I want to answer. It says, is it true there was pushback from the community when the first yeshivas opened? And my answer to that question is yes. There were actually protests. They did not want a yeshiva to open because they felt that it would separate us.
I've invited Lydia Collins to unmute. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to the conversation.
Manchester was a little different, really. It's true that there were Syrian Jews there, and they were amongst the very earliest founders of the community. But one of the difficulties was that
it's very bad water land to the right.
Can you hear? Can you hear me?
So, yes, we hear you fine. We hear you fine.
So they
to the right, to the left.
They worshipped, I think, a little bit differently, and they were considered to be very orthodox. And a lot of them came and didn't want to settle in Britain. They came for business and then returned to their families in Syria. They never brought them with them. So they were a significant part of the community, but they were only a part, I would say about half maybe. But after the First World War, in the beginning of the First World War, the dynamic changed in Manchester, and there was a very much bigger immigration, which Serena mentioned. People were starting to leave, partly because when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled after the First World War, the border was actually put about 50 miles north of Aleppo with Turkey. So they were cut off from a lot of their markets that were north of the border. And of course, the Suez Canal, when that opened, was also having a detrimental effect. So there was a much bigger immigration around about the time of the First World War and after. So they did, after that, I think, probably become the biggest element in Manchester. I can't say an awful lot about it. Basil Judah, who lives in Manchester, may be able to say more than I can, because I have never lived in Manchester. So I only know from my study of the historical movements. I don't know anything from my own personal experience of what goes on in Manchester. But Basil might want to say something, I don't know.
Thank you. Can I just ask both of you, because you just mentioned the border going up between Syria and Turkey. And my understanding is the town of Iskandarun, Alexandria, something.
Yes.
Did that have its own? Did that have its own population, own community, or was that just a satellite of Aleppo?
Well, my understanding is because it was on the coast, that was the port that they exported from. So there would have been a small presence there. There were a lot. Aleppo was actually a bit like London. It was the main center, but there were a lot of satellite towns round about that you hear, unfortunately, in the news now, like Idlib and Urfa and all these places where the fighting is. They were all like satellite towns of Aleppo. When the border went up, some were north of the border and some were south of the border.
Yes. Okay, could I just, I'm just going to unmute Adam Brown if he wishes to say anything. Adam sort of runs the Avatenus sort of DNA project, and I'm just wondering if he's joined us for that that reason.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, it's nice to see you.
Hi. Well, I come because I always like to hear Serena talk. So the other thing is I wanted to mention that Serena has helped us a great deal in recruiting Syrian participants in the DNA project, and we have over 100. So we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in the Syrian community, and we encourage anyone who has been tested or wishes to be tested to join our project, which is simply by going to www.jewishdna.org and logging in. Or if you can't do that, just shoot me an email. But I will tell you that the Syrian results are absolutely fascinating. And we can pick out a Y chromosome that's Sephardi from a Y chromosome that's Musta'arabi very quickly, because we start seeing matches in Mexico and Central America and Morocco, and we know we're on the trail. But I want to mention to you that also the question about Musta'arabi versus the Sephardi origins, I can tell you that I don't think I've ever seen anyone yet who's pure one or the other coming at us.
Yeah.
You know, they've been together for 500 years, and I don't think the walls are quite as high as, you know, the community leads us to believe. That's all I have to say. It's Serena, it was a great talk. I love hearing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
No,
you.
great. Thank you.
David, there's a question here that I'd like to answer. It's from Comunidad Brit Braha, CDMX.
Yes.
It says, I would like to ask about the ban on conversions and intermarriage. Please explain a bit more. If someone marries a Gentile or a convert, do you expel them? Do you stop talking to them? So I actually wrote about this. This was my master's thesis project. And I will tell you that the social isolation is worse than the religious isolation. There was an instance where a child was in Magen David Yeshiva, and it was found out that her maternal grandmother was a convert to Judaism before 1935, when the Takana was issued. The child was expelled from school. The child was sat in a corner and publicly humiliated. Kid didn't know what hit him. There was an instance of someone who had converted. So the Takana, the way it's written is that if you convert not for the purpose of marriage, if you just convert because you have a love of Torah, a love of Judaism, that you will be accepted. That was in the 1927 Argentina one. And it said that if you went to Jerusalem and had your conversion done in Jerusalem, that it would be accepted. So someone in the community had a grandparent who had married. She was a frum Jew, but there was an intermarriage somewhere along her maternal line, and she was going to marry someone in the community, and they said no. So she went to Israel, and Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef converted her himself. And she comes back to the community with this conversion paper, and they do not accept it. Ovadia Yosef came himself from Israel to New York to argue with the Rabbinic Council on it, and they would not accept it. And they said if we allowed that to happen, then we would have a lot of people doing these types of conversions. So we will not accept it. Now, if you go to pray in the synagogue, are they going to tell you, no, you have to leave? No, they're not going to do that. They're not going to be so publicly humiliate you. They're not going to give you an aliyah, okay? They're not going to accept your child into a yeshiva, but they're not going to publicly humiliate you in the sense that if you walk into the synagogue to pray, and we know people who have done it, they've prayed for years in the synagogue and they might have had a wife who was a convert. So I hope that answers the question. The families that are involved with this aren't going to stop talking to their relatives, but they're also not going to open the doors wide. I don't know how else to put it, but I hope that answers that question.
Okay, we have some other questions on the
Sure.
Ashkenazification and things like that, but I think that's really a bit off topic for us, and it's perhaps a bit
Sure.
bit too non-historic and and too controversial. I'm afraid Tom's having problems with his microphone. Tom, can you try to speak? Tom is silenced. I'm really sorry about that. I mean, thank you so much. Does anybody have any final questions? We've actually sort of gone over our normal time. Okay, I just got a message from Tom. Okay, Serena, thank you very much, because that's a topic on which I know very little, and a lot of people do. Our core audience is Western Sephardic, and I think what we're discovering, as Adam said, is there's much more interaction and involvement. You know, I grew up thinking that, you know, the Western Sephardim in London and Amsterdam we're something different and special, but it ain't true, and we're finding that everybody is related to everybody else, which is good and as it should be. We will post a recording of this, assuming the recording works, to the Sephardic Genealogy YouTube page, hopefully next week. I'd like to remind everybody that this is a sort of self-funding effort, and if anybody wants to help us on Patreon, that would be great. And many thanks to everybody who does. You know who you are, and we're really grateful. Our speaker next week is Professor Stephen Nadler, and he is going to be talking about Manasseh Yisrael and his conflict with other rabbis, which obviously most notably Saul Levi Mortera and Isaac Aboab. We very much hope you can join us then. We apologize as ever for our technical problems. I will try to actually get myself a new computer. And let me try to unmute everybody if people want to say goodbye. And thank you very much. Thank you, Serena. I will actually buy your cookbook, because I really enjoy food from that part of the world. And yes, so on behalf of Ton and me, thank you